The mansion doors swung wide open, and in that instant, everything Richard Hale thought he understood about fatherhood was about to be put to the ultimate test. Fresh off a transatlantic flight, the sound of his impeccably shined shoes echoed against the marble floor as he pulled his expensive suitcase behind him. To any casual observer, Richard looked every bit the part of a man who had dominated boardrooms across Europe. Impeccably tailored suit, a gold watch glinting on his wrist, and a confident stride that spoke of success. But beneath that polished exterior, his heart beat with a softer anticipation. Tied to the handle of his suitcase was a small, well-loved teddy bear, his son Ethan's absolute favorite. It had been almost a month since he'd last seen his boy, and Richard had been picturing their joyful reunion in his mind. Ethan sprinting into his arms, his laughter echoing through the halls, the sweet promise of quality time finally made up for. But fate rarely sticks to the script we've so carefully written. Richard's early return was intended to be a surprise. Instead, it was about to become the opening act of something he could never have possibly imagined. With each step he took deeper into his quiet, cavernous home, his chest grew tighter, not from the lingering effects of travel, but from the palpable weight of his absence. He pictured Ethan's bright blue eyes lighting up the moment he saw him. Imagined the warmth and strength of his son's hug, a reward far greater than any victory he'd achieved overseas. Yet, lurking beneath his excitement was a truth he'd been desperately trying to ignore. Money and success had kept him away, leaving Ethan to sleep alone in an empty room, night after lonely night. Richard was about to learn the hard way that surprises don't always come wrapped in ribbons and joy. Sometimes, they arrive hidden in the deepest shadows, waiting patiently in the very heart of his home, where genuine love had been missing for far too long. Richard's footsteps slowed considerably as he reached the kitchen doorway, his hand still resting on the familiar teddy bear tied to his suitcase. He expected to find only silence, maybe the quiet hum of the refrigerator or the lingering aroma of a late-night snack. Instead, the scene that unfolded before him stopped him dead in his tracks, rooting him to the floor. At the kitchen counter stood a young black woman he didn't recognize at all. Her simple gray apron was wrinkled, and her shoulders were trembling slightly, as if she were carrying the weight of the entire world on them. Her face was turned away from him, but the sound of her muffled sobs filled the room like a secret that could no longer be contained or hidden. Wrapped tightly around her waist, clinging to her with all the strength his tiny arms could muster, was Ethan, Richard's only son, his pride and joy. The boy's cheeks were blotchy and red, his eyes swollen from crying, and his small fingers dug desperately into the fabric of the woman's apron, as though she were the last safe place left on earth. Ethan wasn't simply hugging her. He was holding on for dear life. "Ethan," Richard said sharply, his voice trembling more with utter confusion than with anger. But neither the child nor the caregiver turned around at first. Only when his tone grew noticeably firmer did the woman's head snap around. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of panic. It was the unmistakable expression of someone caught completely off guard, exposed in a moment they never intended for anyone else to witness. "Daddy, no," Ethan wailed suddenly, his voice cracking with distress. "Don't take her away from me." The words struck Richard's chest like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. The woman swallowed hard, her voice tight with emotion as she finally spoke. "I'm so sorry, sir. He just won't let go." She gently tried to loosen Ethan's grip, but the boy only clung to her even harder, shaking with a visible desperation that tugged at Richard's heart. In that instant, Richard realized this was no ordinary interaction between a housekeeper and her employer's child. His son wasn't simply seeking comfort. He was desperately begging not to lose it, whatever it was. And Richard, for the first time in what felt like years, felt the sharp, unfamiliar sting of being a complete stranger in his own home. The woman steadied her breath, her eyes darting nervously between Richard and the little boy, who was still buried securely against her shoulder. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, but steady enough to carry. "The agency sent me last month when your former nanny left. We spoke on the phone a couple of times, remember? You approved me yourself." Richard blinked, searching his memory for the recollection. Yes, there had been a voice, calm and professional, on the other end of the line, but nothing that had prepared him for this unexpected scene. Nothing that could even begin to explain why his son was clinging to this woman as if she were his only lifeline. Naomi gently stroked Ethan's back, her own tears threatening to spill over, but she stubbornly refused to let them fall. I accidentally burned the rice earlier, she admitted with a sad, almost bitter laugh. That's why I was crying. But it wasn't because of you, Ethan. She paused, gathering the courage to say the words that had been weighing so heavily on her chest. It's because Ethan told me he wished I was his mommy. The kitchen fell into a heavy silence, the faint hiss of a forgotten pot on the stove the only sound that dared to break the tension. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the woman's words hitting him harder and deeper than he wanted to show. He glanced down at Ethan, whose small hands were now trembling even more as he clung even tighter to Naomi's apron. I didn't ask for that, Naomi added quickly, her voice cracking with sincerity. I didn't try to take anyone's place in his life, but he's been having nightmares almost every night. He calls out for someone, anyone, and there's been no one here but me. So I held him, sang to him, stayed with him until he could finally breathe easily again. Richard felt his chest cave in, as if the air had been suddenly sucked out of the room. Weeks of 18-hour workdays, endless meetings, and high-stakes deals meant to secure Ethan's future suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. He vaguely remembered a brief, almost throwaway message from his former nanny about Ethan crying in his sleep, but he had brushed it off as nothing more than a fleeting phase. But looking now at his son's swollen, tear-filled eyes and Naomi's raw, tear-streaked face, Richard finally understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a phase, it was profound loneliness. And in his prolonged absence, a complete stranger had somehow become the one and only person who made his child feel genuinely safe, secure, and loved. Richard's throat tightened as he continued to watch the heartbreaking scene unfold before him. Ethan's small voice broke through his jumbled thoughts, ragged and desperate. She helps me breathe, Daddy. The simple words cut deeper than any boardroom insult or failed business deal ever could. For years, Richard had been telling himself that he was working tirelessly for Ethan, building a vast empire so that his boy would never have to know struggle, would never have to want for anything in the world. But standing there in that ordinary kitchen, he saw the devastating truth that he had been refusing to face for far too long. Money couldn't chase away the terrifying monsters in his son's nightmares, and even the most carefully worded contracts couldn't hold a small, scared child through the long, dark nights. Naomi looked down, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. I'm not necessarily asking to stay, she said softly, though her voice still trembled with a hint of something unspoken. I just didn't realize how deeply I was already in until he said that. Her gaze flickered towards Richard, her expression an equal mix of fragility and unyielding strength. He needed someone, Mr. Hale, and I was simply here. For the first time in his entire life, Richard felt the carefully chosen words completely slip away from him, leaving behind only a heavy, suffocating silence. He had effortlessly commanded entire floors of high-powered executives, dismantled rival companies with sharp precision and cold calculation. But now, standing before a crying child and a woman he barely knew, he felt utterly and completely powerless. His carefully constructed image of success began to crack as guilt settled heavily in his chest, an unwelcome and oppressive weight. He had imagined this long-awaited homecoming so differently. A joyful, picture-perfect reunion, Ethan running gleefully into his open arms, the perfect portrait of a devoted father returning triumphantly from a successful business trip. Instead, his son was clinging desperately to the embrace of another, a virtual stranger. And Richard was the outsider, the interloper in his own home. I honestly thought I was doing the right thing, Richard muttered almost to himself, his voice raw with emotion. Working hard, building something lasting for him. Naomi's eyes lifted, her gaze steady and unwavering now, her words slicing cleanly through the tense air. Money doesn't sing lullabies to a child at night, Mr. Hale. It doesn't hold their trembling hand after a bad dream. And with that simple, irrefutable truth, the carefully constructed walls that Richard had painstakingly built around his life choices began to crumble and collapse around him. Ethan pressed his face even deeper into Naomi's side, his small voice muffled against her apron, but filled with a desperate urgency. "Don't make her go, Daddy. Please." The heartfelt plea unraveled Richard from the inside out, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He had returned home laden with expensive gifts, foolishly convinced that they could somehow magically patch up the gaping distance between them. But now, he finally saw just how hollow and meaningless those shallow gestures truly were. His son wasn't begging for the latest toys, extravagant trips, or the empty promise of a brighter, more secure future. He was begging for a far more precious present, for the tangible, unwavering love that he could actually feel and touch. Richard opened his mouth to speak, then quickly closed it, the carefully chosen words catching like sharp gravel in his dry throat. Naomi, steadying herself, placed her hand gently on the top of Ethan's head. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice firm but soothing. "No one's mad at you, remember?" Her comforting words weren't just meant for Ethan. They were subtly aimed at Richard as well, though they carried the unmistakable weight of a gentle reprimand wrapped in heartfelt compassion. "I'm not angry," Richard said quickly, his voice breaking through the heavy silence that had settled over the kitchen. "I could never be mad at him." Naomi's eyes flicked to his, sharp and unafraid. "Show him that." Then, she said plainly, "He's only 4 years old. He doesn't fully understand complex concepts like silence or long hours at the office. All he knows is that you leave for extended periods of time and then come back with gifts instead of warm, comforting hugs." The simple truth stung, hitting Richard harder than he cared to admit. He had naively believed that simply providing financially was enough, that the vast empire he was building was somehow love in another, more practical form. But standing there watching Ethan's tiny shoulders tremble with unspoken fear and sadness, he finally realized the fatal flaw in his way of thinking. Ethan didn't need more concrete proof of his father's wealth. He needed irrefutable proof of his father's love. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he hesitantly reached out toward his son. "Ethan," he said softly, lowering his voice to something more fragile and human. His son hesitated for a moment, clinging even tighter to Naomi's side. And in that telling hesitation, Richard fully understood the staggering depth of the emotional distance that had grown between them, a vast chasm that no amount of money had ever been able to bridge. Richard stayed perfectly still, his arms open in a silent invitation, unsure if his son would ever willingly cross the seemingly insurmountable gap between them. The heavy silence stretched on, broken only by the faint, persistent hiss of the pot on the stove, a constant reminder of the domestic scene he had so carelessly interrupted. Then, slowly, cautiously, like a small child tentatively testing the frigid waters of a cold swimming pool, Ethan reluctantly peeled himself away from Naomi's protective side. His small steps were hesitant, his tear-streaked face lifted cautiously toward his father. There was no joyful sprint, no spontaneous leap into his arms like Richard had wistfully dreamed of during the long, lonely plane ride home. Instead, Ethan moved as if trust itself had become something fragile and precious, something that could easily shatter into a million pieces if he moved too quickly or carelessly. When he finally reached his father, Ethan didn't throw himself forward in a rush of emotion. Instead, he almost melted against him, tentatively testing the warmth of Richard's embrace before finally surrendering to it completely. Richard wrapped his arms tightly around his son, feeling the small body tremble against his chest. His voice cracked, raw with unadulterated regret. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I honestly had no idea how lonely you were." Ethan's reply came in a faint whisper, so quiet it nearly broke Richard's heart in half. "Don't make her leave, Daddy. Please don't." Richard glanced up at Naomi, then tightened his grip around his son. She stood frozen, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of the simple apron at her waist, tears threatening to spill over again. But this time, she didn't attempt to hide them. Her vulnerable face told him everything he needed to know, how deeply she genuinely cared for Ethan, how afraid she was of being summarily dismissed, how much of herself she had already selflessly given to his troubled little boy. "I honestly don't want her to leave either," Richard said softly, the unexpected words surprising even himself as they left his lips. Naomi's lips parted slightly in shock, her breath catching in her throat as though she hadn't dared to hope for such a possibility. In that pivotal moment, Richard finally realized that it wasn't just Ethan who had been rescued by Naomi's unexpected presence in their lives. She had saved him too, forcing him to see the deep, ugly cracks in the carefully curated life he had mistakenly thought was perfect, and giving him the precious opportunity to rebuild it, not with vast amounts of wealth, but with the simple, unwavering power of genuine love. Naomi's hands stilled at her sides, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope as Richard's heartfelt words settled between them. "Sir, please," she began cautiously, her voice low and almost uncertain. "I really don't want to overstep my boundaries here. I was hired to keep the house in order, not." Richard shook his head firmly, though his voice carried a newfound gentleness that it hadn't possessed before. "Not just as the maid, Naomi. Stay as someone who genuinely cares about him. Maybe, just maybe, even as someone who can help me learn how to finally be the father that he truly deserves." The weight of the sincere sentence hung heavily in the air between them. Ethan looked up, his small hand still clutching Richard's sleeve, his eyes glistening with hopeful anticipation. "Can she, Daddy, please?" Naomi's throat tightened with emotion. "I really don't want to cross any lines," she whispered, her carefully constructed composure faltering slightly. "Cross them," Richard said, his gaze steady and unflinching. "If that's what it honestly takes for him to feel safe and secure again, then please, cross them." For the first time since Richard had walked through the kitchen doorway, a genuine warmth flickered across Naomi's features. It wasn't a triumphant, boastful smile, but something far gentler and more profound, a cautious, almost hesitant acceptance. She exhaled slowly, her posture softening noticeably as if she had been unconsciously holding her breath for weeks, bracing herself for the inevitable. The neglected pot on the stove bubbled over, the faint, acrid scent of burned rice filling the small kitchen, but no one moved to fix it. It simply didn't matter anymore. What truly mattered was the small, vulnerable boy pressed securely between them, his tiny heartbeat gradually slowing as his fractured world slowly began to feel whole and complete again. Richard reached for the small, well-worn teddy bear still tied to his suitcase, and carefully handed it to Ethan. "I brought this back for you," he said softly, his voice unsteady with emotion. "But I should have brought myself back sooner." Ethan hugged both the beloved bear and his father tightly, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, he didn't shed a single tear. Later that evening, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep, nestled contentedly in his father's lap, Richard found Naomi in the hallway, quietly wiping down the stove, erasing all traces of the earlier disaster. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression still uncertain, as though she were still waiting to be dismissed from her duties. Instead, Richard spoke softly, his voice filled with heartfelt gratitude. "I know this probably wasn't the job you originally expected when you took it." Naomi gave a small, tired smile. "It's definitely not. But honestly, Mr. Hale, it's exactly the job I needed." Richard nodded slowly, his voice steady but humbled. "If you ever want something more, any additional training or schooling, whatever it is, you'll definitely have my complete support. Just promise me one thing, Naomi." Her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "What's that, sir?" "Don't ever stop being exactly who you were today, for him." Naomi's eyes softened, the carefully constructed walls she had erected around her heart finally beginning to crumble and fall. "I honestly couldn't if I tried, Mr. Hale." As Richard turned back toward the living room, he paused momentarily, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Naomi, thank you. Thank you for saving my son." She didn't respond with mere words, only a quiet nod of her head before returning to the stove, where a fresh pot of rice had just begun to gently simmer, filling the home with its comforting, familiar aroma. True, lasting love isn't measured by the material wealth we accumulate and leave behind. It's measured by the genuine presence we give today, in the present moment. Children don't need vast empires built in their names. They need genuine laughter shared at the dinner table, strong, comforting arms to hold them tightly after terrifying nightmares, and someone who consistently shows up when it truly matters the most. What about you? Have you ever realized that the smallest acts of sincere love often matter far more than the biggest sacrifices? Share your own personal story in the comments section below. I'd genuinely love to hear it. And if this heartwarming story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and ring that little notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale of love, redemption, and the profound power of second chances.